Today's talk is Bob Hirshon. He's Senior Project Manager at the AAAS, American Association of Advancement of Science. He's Principal Investigator for the NSF-sponsored award-winning Kinetic City project. He also has been doing Science Update for 23 years on the radio, and in general he's been very active in science education for children. And he's going to be talking to us today, as you can see on the slide, reporters, fair, balanced, and gullible.
All right. Well, thank you for coming out. Thanks, Marv, and thanks, JD, for having me here. And thanks also to the National Capital Area Skeptics. It's really an honor. It's also very daunting to speak in front of a group of skeptics. I know you're going to be back there saying, yeah, sure. I don't believe any of it. So it's difficult. And this is a talk I haven't given before. This is something that, I talked over with JD, what would be a good topic, and I thought this would be kind of interesting. So welcome. I bid you greetings from the lamestream media, which I am a representative. And actually, I like to know my audience when I'm giving a talk or writing a story. So I just want to find out a little bit about what kind of media you guys use. So where do you get your news? Would it be, just show of hands, I guess. Television news, a little bit. Newspapers, a lot of newspapers. Public radio, okay. Commercial radio, oh, not too much. Okay, well, obviously you're not real Americans. Because, the internet. I'm sorry, internet. News from the internet. Wow. Okay. Well, I was going to say real Americans get their news from Bill O'Reilly and from commercial talk news, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, and things like that. And I'm joking, but, one of the reasons we started this radio show that I do, Science Update, was because such a large percentage of people do get their news from some of these AM commercial talk news outlets. And we thought, that's where we want to be. And so that's where Science Update actually is heard. I work at a little place called the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Its headquarters are right here in Washington, 1200 New York Avenue. And you actually may have heard, we have an annual meeting every year, and it goes around to different cities. And it's going to be here in Washington this year in February. February 18th through the 21st, I think it is. And it's one of those, it's a rare thing because it's all about science writ large. It's not just chemistry or biochemistry or physics or something even more siloed than that. It's all of science, and there's very little of that. And it's a lot of fun, so consider coming out. It'll be at the convention center. And all sorts of luminaries, and there'll be all sorts of things for the public that'll be there as well. I came to the AAAS I had been at WGBH television and radio in Boston for a year on a fellowship. And I was really excited about coming to AAAS and starting this radio show because I thought, wow, this will be all people just like me. It's a whole association, 300, 400 people there, all that are really into science in general and kind of all science nerds like me. So it was very exciting. I moved down here from Boston. I had a window office, which was very cool, on the 8th floor in the communications department. So I thought, communications and membership, this is where the people will be the most interested in science. It's not just, some particular discipline within Science magazine. And it was in October, and I looked outside my window, and this monarch butterfly went flitting, we're 8 stories up in the middle of a city. And it was really cool. I thought, it's like that time of year. This is there's all these different generations of monarch butterflies, and the one in the fall is the one that goes from North America all the way, from Canada all the way down to this little area in Mexico where they overwinter. And I thought that was pretty cool. And then 2 more go by, and then another one, and then 3 more, and they're just going by my window. And I was like, ever since the Ice Age, these butterflies have been migrating here, and they don't care if a city and a skyscraper has come or gone or whatever. They're just doing the same route. So I run out run out into the hall, sorry, JD, and there's people there, it's like coffee hour or something, and I say, you got to check this out, there's these monarch butterflies, and they're like migrating by my window. There's like silence. And I was like, they're right here. If you come over, there's like they're coming right now. They're the little orange butterflies. They go from North America, they go to Mexico, they overwinter. And there's silence again. And then finally someone says, well, why don't you go out, get a net and catch one? I'm like, okay. So that's just by way of illustrating that not everybody in the world, you're in this little group, with your friends that have similar interests, and you think the world is like that, and they may be very different. So I'll tell you a little bit about AAAS, very, 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 very briefly. It's established in 1848. It's the world's oldest, largest science association. Published Science magazine. We're probably best known for that. It's an open membership. It covers all disciplines. That's very rare nowadays. Members receive Science magazine, and a lot of people see joining AAAS as basically subscribing to Science magazine as opposed to joining this big association. But we do lots of other stuff, and the Science Update show that I do is one of the things that members are supporting. And our mission is to advance science and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. Very grand. And here is Science Update. This is our website. It's a one minute radio show. It's reporting on scientific research, and we also answer listeners' questions. It's broadcast nationally. It's been on since January of 1988. It's 5 days a week. And it's on these news talk stations that you hear personalities like G. Gordon Liddy and Rush Limbaugh on. And the reason we did that, it was very, my boss, Carol Rogers, who's now at the University of Maryland, met Ron Nesson, who is the vice president of news for Mutual Broadcasting. He used to be President Ford's press secretary. And they just had this idea. He was on Mutual. It was on hundreds of radio stations around the country. There was like no science on it, hardly at all, because they just had general reporters. Why don't they get together, AAAS and Mutual, and start this news service? And so that's what they hired me to do. So I got to start the show, decide what it would be called, and all that sort of stuff. And actually back then it was 90 seconds, which was an eternity on commercial talk news. How many folks listen at all to show of hands, like WTOP and some of those stations? So you know that you don't hear stories that are longer than 15, 20 seconds very often. 30, 40 maybe if it's some major thing. But a minute and a half was a lot to give me. And so that was, that was really a big thing on their part. And then eventually we were convinced to go down to 1 minute. So, the whole reason was to reach the 90% or so of people, believe it or not, who don't listen to public radio. It's true. It's like, you hear the millions of people who listen, but most people listen to the radio. A lot of people get news from the radio. And there's 10 times that many who can't find public radio on the radio dial, have never heard of public radio. I was at a conference once for science and medical reporters in the middle of the country, and I made a reference to, this was years ago, to Bob Edwards, because they were talking about different delivery styles. And the moderator said, and I made this long point about his delivery style and everything, and the guy at the microphone said, "Who the hell is Bob Edwards?" But the kicker was, and I said, on NPR. And everybody laughed. They just, NPR. Oh, because these guys were all like doctors who were on like either television or local commercial radio stations. And to them, NPR was like college station or something, or an academic thing. They didn't see it the way we see it as public radio. So there's a lot of people like that out there. So the audience for our show is regular people. I try to, when I'm thinking of a show idea, I try to think of the security guard downstairs. If I walked up to her and said, "Oh, there's this cool thing happening," would she think it was cool? Would she think it was interesting? Would she be able to follow it? And just regular people. Now, here at the National Science Foundation, every now and then they conduct a survey, to see just how dumb Americans are. They don't call it that, but that's basically the gist of it. And year after year, they find out that we do not know whether the Earth goes around the sun or vice versa. And that's true. It's a very high percentage. Whether an atom is bigger or smaller than a cell. So you wonder what they would make of a science report that they'd hear on NPR or something if they don't know these things. Is it because we're uneducated? Well, here is a clip. Let's see. I'll have to leave my presentation because I'm just getting these blocks. But that's okay because I've got this. I've got a link that I can click on that shows even highly educated people can have misconceptions about science.
Candidate in art.
Despite a lifetime of the very best education, students in our classrooms are failing to learn science. Many of these students will graduate from college with the same scientific misconceptions that they had on entering grade school. To test how a lifetime of education affects our understanding of science, we asked these recent graduates some simple questions in astronomy. Consider, for example, that the causes of the seasons is a topic taught in every standard curriculum.
Okay, I think the seasons happen because as the Earth travels around the sun, it gets nearer to the sun, which produces warmer weather, and gets farther away, which produces colder weather, and hence the seasons.
How hot it is or how cold it is at any given time of the year has to do with the closeness of the Earth to the sun during the seasonal periods.
The Earth goes around the sun, and it gets hotter when we get closer to the sun, and it gets colder when we get further away from the sun.
These graduates, like many of us, think of the Earth's orbit as a highly exaggerated ellipse. Even though the Earth's orbit is very nearly circular, with distance producing virtually no effect on the seasons, we carry with us the strong, incorrect belief that changing distance is responsible for the seasons.
Okay, so that's not only elementary school, that's not only college, that's not only freshmen in college. We're talking about graduates at a fairly prestigious university. And just recently, that was long ago, there's another one that they did with, it was the same film group, where they did, they carried around a piece of wood, and they said, where does it come from? How does the wood form, when the tree grows? And the misconception there was that it all comes up through the roots. It's minerals, it's food and stuff that the tree takes up, as opposed to mostly coming from the carbon dioxide and air. And just this week, there was a report from Michigan State University where they talked to students, many of them science students, many of them advanced science students at universities around the country, asking them the same question, and they got the same result. They were mystified by the concept that the tree could have formed from a gas, from carbon dioxide working with the sun. And they're biology students in many cases. So these are college students, and my audience isn't college students necessarily, it's just regular people. So I can't make many assumptions about what my audience knows about science when I start. And that's going to have a big effect on what stories I cover and how I report them. Another thing is my medium, which is radio, and time constraints. There are stories that you just can't do very well on the radio. There's just recently one on optical illusions, and it's just too hard to describe an optical illusion. It's a really cool story to describe an optical illusion on the radio. And on the other hand, there's some things I think work much better on the radio than work on television. We have a single channel, which is just audio. I think you can focus more on comparing bird songs or music or ancient musical instruments or other things than you can on even television, because I don't think you focus on the audio as well. So when I began writing this presentation, really what I thought I'd be doing is poking fun at my own profession, fair, balanced, gullible. showing you lots of embarrassing reporting gaffes, and generally talking about how we need to do a better job. And there will be quite a lot of that. But as I was deconstructing sort of what goes into a news story and all the different constraints under which we operate, I actually started to marvel at the fact that we don't screw up more often. Reporters have to keep tabs on everything that's going on in the world of science now, which has gotten incredibly diverse. We have to find research that's the most important and or the most interesting. They're not always the same thing. Sometimes there's a new study coming out. You know it's really important, but it's really boring. It has a lot of steps to understanding why it's important that would be hard to get across in a half an hour or a week, let alone in a minute. There are other things that are darn interesting, but they're not that important. And sometimes we cover them anyway. But you try to have that balance. And now we start to get into one of the ways people can go astray, because then you have to sell that story to an editor. Well, all of a sudden, now you're an advocate. And you have to be really aware of this. You're no longer, you try to be when you're doing the selection process, somewhat unbiased and trying to take lots of different things into account. But all of a sudden, once you make that decision, you're selling it to an editor. And even if it's subconscious, you may be sexing it up a little bit, to the phrase that the British used about the weapons of mass destruction reports, because you really want to get that on the. It's your job to get that on the air. It's your job to convince that editor that this is important. Well, all of a sudden, you can run into a problem there. Then you have to research the story, find out who to talk to, what to ask them. You have to sort of really quickly become sort of an expert on the story. Well, we have, Science Update, we have some time because we do like 2 weeks worth of stories, and we may have a few days to work on them before we have to go and actually go into the studio. But if you're at a news outlet like at National Public Radio, you're pitching that story in the morning, and it may not be newsworthy tomorrow. You may have to have it on All Things Considered that afternoon. And you may not know much about, this quantum tunneling or whatever it is, but you have to, you can't sound like an idiot when you're talking to the researcher. So you have to quickly come up to speed, find out who to talk to. Obviously, in many cases, there's a study, and that's what makes it news. It's coming out. So you have a list of the people who worked on the study. But you may want to talk to other folks that didn't work on the study, and just to get a different perspective. And you have to get them that day, and you have to get them in a place where their audio will be recordable. So there's all of those mechanics. Then you have to put all that material together, figure out what the story really is, because what you pitched this morning that was so cool may no longer be the story that it's become, because you've learned more about it. But you're invested in it. You put all that time into it. You may not want to kill it at that point. And you have to write it up for a non-scientist and reconvince the editor, who by then has forgotten what you pitched them. Say, why did I, or it may not look the same, did I say yes to this? And then you have to write it up and get it back on, and then you have to forget about it completely, because you have to move on to the next story. So that can all happen rather quickly. And so you can see why, sometimes you'll see a story and say, boy, they got that wrong. Well, you can sort of see, how that can happen. At Science Update, we don't have that problem as much because we're sort of self-contained, we're trusted. We're not doing breaking news in the same way. We're doing more kind of interesting little science features. Our stuff doesn't get on fast enough to be breaking news. So often it's the sidebar behind the news. Because it's only 1 minute, less than a minute, we don't do a lot of really controversial things that we can't do justice to in that time. But these are the constraints and the world that these reporters are working under. One of the things people ask me a lot is, well, how do you find story ideas? Where do you come up with all this stuff? So the primary sources are, well, primary, that's the wrong word. The main sources are science journals, press releases, conferences, that sort of thing. There are thousands of science journals. And obviously you cannot possibly go through all of them. Many of them come out like every week. Eureka Alert is a website which anybody can go to. It's at eurekalert.org that the AAAS does. And it's just this place where universities and journals put press releases. And I'm going to show you that in a little bit. And so every day, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of new press releases on new research that's being conducted. The major journals send out early copies of the embargoed articles that is going to be in the following week's journal, so reporters can have a little bit of time to learn about them and get their story together ahead of time, which is really, really helpful. We get ideas from breaking news. Something just happens. That the fish kills and bird kills lately is breaking news, and you can get stories based on that. And in that case, you have no journal article, you have no peer review. You just have to go out and find sources to answer your questions. So and that's one of the more challenging things. So earthquakes happen, cows explode, meteorites appear at a running event, which was something that happened last year and got a lot of coverage because people are watching on TV and this fireball appears over this marathon event. I say, what is it? We don't know. Well, it must be a UFO. It must be a visitor from another planet. And then the other place you get ideas is contacts. You have people that you talk with. They're doing research. They have someone else who's doing something really cool, and you can talk to them, visit their lab. So when I started, back in 1987, AAAS had a library, and I would go there. The journals would come in. I'd hang out. I sort of took it as I was very proud to find stories that were in really obscure journals that I knew nobody else would be covering, like the Society of Limnology or the Proceedings of the Mycology Association or something, and there were cool things hiding in there. Well, now there were a lot then, but you just didn't know about them all. So these come out all the time. So if you're a science journalist, well, you want to keep tabs on astronomy, but you may also be you don't want to be in the astronomy ghetto, so you have to do chemistry. And these come out all the time, and all of them are pushing their stories. These are just a few of the top ones. They just go and go and go. When you go into the alphabetical listings, you really see how many there are. So, when AAAS started, you could be an expert in science. You could, take all science as your province. It gets increasingly difficult when even chemistry is broken up to this extent. The press releases, I had mentioned Eureka Alert before. So this is what it looks like. So this is from yesterday. These were all posted. So this is pretty intriguing because someone is they've done your work for you in a way. They've taken some scientific research and written it up as a press release. On the other hand, it's their job to make it really cool because they want their researchers there. So again, source of bias. You have to take this with a grain of salt. So I'm going to show you these. So we're scanning these. This is just in one day. No, and the other thing is, they really range from catchy names like pesky bacterial slimes to all of these are fairly catchy. Some of them are incredibly technical, and you can't rule them out based on that. You have to try to wade right in with microRNA TP53 circuit connected to chronic lymphocytic leukemia, because there could be a really cool story hiding in there. So that's part of our daily routine, is going through these. Okay, so this is very neat. This is the science press package. I just use science magazines, but Nature sends us theirs. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. All these different journals send this stuff a week ahead. And I'm showing you last week's because it would be a very large faux pas if I showed you next week's stories. Because you have to sign up for these and they have to clear you as a member of the media. But it's great because you get little synopses of the stories coming up in science, as well as links to PDFs of the galleys. They're not always complete, but the stories in progress. And mostly they're just final little edits. Before anybody else gets to see them, And you probably saw a lot of these in the news. That do human tears send a signal? That was the story. Got a lot of play. That there's a substance in women's tears that inhibits testosterone production. And nobody knows why. It's just a cool... That's a story not probably important, but really, really interesting. And so a lot of these, I don't know if any of the others actually came up. Oh, yeah, the Gulf bacteria and how quickly they digested the methane from the oil spill was a really big story. So you might wonder, when you hear these coming Thursday evenings or Friday mornings, wow, those reporters, man, they got all these interviews and they got all this stuff together and they got all this video shot the second that embargo was lifted. Well, they had a week to do it, so that does, that helps a lot. And that really goes a long way in making these stories more accurate. Giving people a chance to actually work on them ahead of time. Oh, and I'm sorry, we'll just have to go back through our greatest hits. So, and by the way, if you have any questions, comments, or things like that, that's fine. This can be freewheeling and interactive. If there's something that just can't wait. Lisa, something just can't wait. They vary. That's a good question. I think with the ones that we get sent out are for the print version. But often, well, I mean, you can't write anything about that subject until whatever date they give you. So sometimes they'll say Science Express, and it'll be, it's going to be in Science Express on this date, so you can't do it until 2 p.m. or 4 p.m. that day or something. So they'll let you know. And they take it very seriously. Boy, reporters go, break these early, then it's a very serious infraction. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, didn't the cold fusion thing, I think, wasn't
Cold
that around
fusion.
1990?
Yeah.
And wasn't that to some extent due to the press department?
Yeah, they kind of broke it on their own. They didn't, I don't remember exactly, but it wasn't actually published yet, was it? And I don't think it was published. That wasn't peer reviewed.
Well, the university did it. The university actually did I think, a press conference about it.
Yeah.
So they were really the culprits.
Yeah. So that's, and it's really, it's sad, it's become very high profile. It's also a cautionary tale, when the university gets out ahead of the story and gets so excited by it that it doesn't go through normal peer review channels. Not that peer review is perfect, but it's the best that we have now, best way of ensuring that these things are true before before they get disseminated to the public. So, again, we're talking about fair, balanced, gullible, where do reporters get it wrong? Well, you see right from the start, there's all sorts of ways that we can go wrong. All of those articles, press releases, and everything that we just saw, even the ones in the peer-reviewed journals, were selected by someone. Something got into Science, something else didn't get in. Someone has an interest in this area and maybe not in another. So already, there's some selection bias going on there where really important research might get ignored because it, for whatever reason, doesn't make it into the journals that journalists are looking at, because we can't look at all those thousands and thousands of them. Even the scientific studies have sort of a positive spin to them. Obviously, if you found some really cool thing about comb jellyfish, and that's what you've been studying all your life, you can't help but, you're not going to be totally objective when you find this really cool thing that gets in a big journal and you're writing about it. So you're going to put a positive spin on it that way. The press release that then takes that and tries to sell it to the public, to reporters, is totally written to convince you that this is the most important thing ever. And so you're dealing with that. Reporters themselves may be biased toward or against things, sometimes their own field, what they studied. Many science reporters started out in the sciences, and they have things that they're really interested in. And they may report glowingly on those. Or sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes the field that you know the best is the one you're most skeptical about. And they say, oh, that's that John Smith who did that report, and that's, and you may have your own biases against certain things. You may be much tougher than you would be against another field. There's biases due to the requirements of the medium. Just can't do that story. This is a radio show and it's too visual. We can't cover it. Or we don't have enough time or whatever. And then there's all the things that are true of all stories, science or not. Negative results are less interesting than positive ones. It's just kind of the way the human mind works. Lethal things are more interesting than benign things. If it's going to kill you, it's going to get your attention. People aren't going to switch the radio station if they hear something that is lethal is about to be described. Things that are counterintuitive are more interesting than intuitive ones. We get so many stories that come out in journals, and they are confirming something that most Americans thought was already confirmed. That's already, everybody knows that. Well, we didn't know that. We assumed it because it was intuitive. And this research is really important because it's the first confirmation that that's really true. Well, try to get that across to people. You know, when you're doing a story saying, I know you already knew this, but now you are justified in knowing it. It's like knowing people don't care enough. Reporters try to get a spread of disciplines, at least we do. And so if we've just done some stories on brain research, we feel, oh, we did 3, and something else comes up, we may pass on it because we just did a bunch of brain stories. Well, that's not saying anything about whether that was worthy of being covered or not. It just happened to fall that week. And so the public may not hear about that because we just did something similar already. Stories get rejected or selected primarily because they're really disgusting. There's some things you just won't hear about. There was a story a couple of months ago, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it involved compounds found in semen. And my producer, Suzanne Bard, thought it was really interesting. And I was like, no. We're not, for the station, first off, they're not going to run it. They're just not going to, as soon as we lead with semen and the thing, they're just not going to air it. So no one's going to hear your story. So, because we're going back and forth. And secondly, it has to be, and she thought, well, that's wrong because we can't judge what's good or bad science based on just because someone might think it's gross. And so we had a long kind of discussion about it. I said, okay, it just has a higher bar. This is a story that's interesting to you as a science person more, and that overcomes anything else. But if we're going to do a story with that in it, with semen, then it's got to be a really important story. And we have to convince them when they complain to us, these radio stations around the country, that, well, we know that you wouldn't normally do this, but we have to justify why we're doing that story. And it did. I did wonder about my ethics, that, well, maybe I shouldn't care. But, so anyways, that's yes?
Just out of curiosity,
How would she react if somebody offered her a story on coprophagia?
Coprophagia, eating poop.
Yeah. Just wondered, out of curiosity. You say you want to talk about something disgusting over here.
Well, see, this is interesting because there's different levels of disgustingness. And there's, every society is different. So coprophagia, first off, it would have to be more than just coprophagia. There would have to be some interesting study that said that in certain circumstances it was adaptive, in certain society. I mean, but we would probably do it.
What about the coffee beans that come out of civets rear end?
We have done that. This is a what's that kind of coffee called? Lampo something, and it's very expensive coffee, and it has a certain je sais quoi flavor, and it's coffee beans that are eaten by a civet cat and pooped out the other end, and they collect them, which is why it's so expensive. They have to follow this civet cat around, and people pay a lot of. It's the most expensive coffee in the world, and so So when I said they're rejected or selected primarily because they're disgusting, I can't remember why we did the civet cat thing, but there was a chemical analysis of what made it so special, and we did that story. And if it had been a chemical analysis of what makes mocha Java coffee, different than some other coffee, we wouldn't have done it. We only did it because of the so it's kind of interesting. And another one just came to mind was, and this I did get in a little trouble for, but I thought I couldn't resist it. It was a story on growing skin grafts from skin samples. From very small amounts of skin, they could grow large amounts that could be transplanted. And their source was foreskins from circumcisions, from baby circumcisions. And those cells made the best skin grafts. And I remember one quote being from a single prepuce, or a single foreskin, they could create a sheet of skin the size of a football field. And I was like, I have to do that story. And I remember Greg Johnson, who is the executive producer for America in the Morning, which is one of our outlets. A day or two later, I mentioned it to him, and he said, "We aired what?" It totally went by him, because I know they aired that story. And he was appalled. But he was interested and impressed with the story, but had he seen that, he wouldn't let the word foreskin be used in one of their morning shows. But they did. But was that the most important story of that day? Probably not. With all that's going on, there were probably other things that we should have covered. But that's just the way the business goes. So beyond that, so that's just bias in selecting stories. How about errors? People actually make mistakes in these stories. Well, first off, there's just lack of knowledge in a particular field. You can't know about everything. I mean, no matter how brilliant you are, there's places where you're not going to be up to snuff, perhaps. In fact, this will be interesting, because this is a very unusual audience. I don't think this is a typical American random sample crowd. But I won't actually give a quiz, but just show of hands. Let's see, physics, biochem. Okay, so it's like 5 or 6 big fields. How many of you would feel comfortable explaining the 4 forces of the universe and the different particles that are associated with them? What? Not in depth. Just could you name the particles and say basically what they were? Hands. Some of you, okay. And then and then in, like, say, biology, how about how DNA makes proteins and why that's important? A few more still. Yeah. And in chemistry, if you had a bunch of reagents and energy, could you say whether they would combine, whether they would react or not under these conditions, if you're given some chemical reagents? Okay. And then electronics, maybe how a silicon chip works, basically a little bit about enough basic, elementary. And then finally, writing a program, a basic program, not in language basic, in some modern computer language like C++, write some basic program. All right. But still less than half of these. And if you put all those together, how many could do all 6? Okay, so in each of these fields, if you went to an expert on that, they'd be like, that's like the most basic thing. That's the atom of my discipline that you're asking about. That's like so elementary to them. And so and so they may very well assume that you know that when you're interviewing them. And so if you say, well, so DNA and it's carried to outside the cell and it makes a protein, what's that about? They'd be like, duh, how do I have to give you an entire course in biology to tell you what my research is? So a lot of reporters are really sharp and do know a good percentage of this, but they can't know it all. And one of the things we're going to get to in a little bit is how the discipline of science journalism is kind of in decline. And so there are fewer reporters that are specialists, and so a lot of science is being covered by just general assignment reporters. And they definitely don't know most of this stuff. So they're approaching it very differently. So easy to see how errors can crop up from that. The flip side of being a specialist is you can get close to your sources. You believe them more than you should. When they tell you something is really important, and also you want to be their friend, and so you may not be as tough in the questioning of them when you're interviewing them. You may want the story too much. You've spent all this time researching it, and you're not going to let it go because you've devoted so much effort and energy to it. So that can be a problem. Similar, the need to sell the story. From the morning you saw the story and pitched it to your editor, you've become its advocate, and that can be a source of error. Something I call 50-50 reporting versus balanced reporting. And 50-50 is, if anybody says this, I've got to find someone else to counter it. And it can totally skew the story because there may be 1,000 people who think this and 3 who think that, and by going back and forth, you're giving the impression that it's a 50-50 thing. And you see that, I was the victim of that, actually. Once I did this children's show. There's nothing bad about a children's radio education program, and it had materials. But the person doing the study, every person he interviewed said, well, what do you like about it? They went, oh, I like this, I like this, I like this, I like this. And they said, okay, what do you like least about it? And they're like, and you'd say, well, if you had to say something, what would it be? So the story came out with one positive thing, and then each person, on the other hand, they found that it was confusing to do this and really would have benefited from this. And then the next section was, I spoke with so-and-so about it, and they liked this, but they didn't like this. And so the whole story, and so the impression at the end was, this is a really crummy program. They've overlooked everything. And when I spoke to the people who were interviewed, they said, that's not how it happened, but that's the way it was reported. But even when you're doing what I would call balanced reporting, like say you're reporting on climate change, and you are deciding who to report and who to leave out, you as a reporter are making decisions. So you're injecting your, and hopefully it's expertise, into the story. And if you're really good at that, then it's going to be a really good story. If you're shaky, or if you're in a field you don't know as much about, you can be balancing it in a totally wrong way. So it really is up to the reporter to do a lot of that, and sometimes they get it right, and sometimes they don't so much. Related to this is sort of the opposing view. You do like to find someone who is going to give the opposite side of a story, something, to try to balance things off a little bit. And you hate to be the one who leaves that out, and who ignores someone just because they're on the outside. And there's sort of a long history of stories in American culture of the person who was never believed. No one believed them. They were tilting at windmills, and then they finally prevailed. And you don't want to be the person who is squelching that voice. You want to be the person who's, encouraging it. Certainly, was Albert Wedgner, the continental drift guy, but I thought he was a crackpot. And, he's the established science community didn't lend any credence at all to what he said, and he turned out to be right. So as a science reporter, you want to keep your eyes open for that sort of thing, too. So, very difficult. I was doing it's certainly not continental drift, but I was doing a story on an invention conference. And it was at the Boston Museum of Science. And everybody had all of their displays out, and it was all sorts of things, crazy inventions and mouse traps and all sorts of things. And there was one guy, his last name was Marks, I can't remember his first name. He was probably 80 years old, and he had these styrofoam balls and a fan. And one of the styrofoam balls was the Earth, and then one was the moon. And then he had this piece of cardboard that was like just a piece of cardboard on a pipe cleaner, and a fan and the sun. And I was like, wow, what's this? And he said, oh, it's a space-based defense system. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, because they send the missiles up, and this thing here is a capacitor. You know what a capacitor is, right? And I said, yeah, I know. It's just all the way back to Ben Franklin with the capacitor. It just stores charge, and then it releases it suddenly, it's not, it's not rocket science. And he said, right, so I have this giant capacitor in space, and then when you trigger it, it zaps the missile that's coming from Russia. And I was like, and the whole time, and I'm recording him, and I'm like, oh, I want to use this because it's so funny, but I don't want to ridicule this, this poor guy who set this thing up, and he's very excited about it. And so in the end, I didn't use his voice, and I just, in passing, said, there was everything from advanced yo-yos to space-based defense systems that, I just mentioned in passing. A few months later, front page of the Wall Street Journal, one of those little drawings, was this guy. And he had just sold his space-based defense capacitor. He had patented it. He had sold it, I think, to General Electric GTE or Aerospace for, I believe, $15 million. And he had turned down, I think, $28 million from someone else because they wouldn't make him chief of research or something, but this place would. So he took only $15 million. It was stunning. And I was this close to, just using him as the butt of a joke in this story. And it just goes to show, you have to be extremely careful. And, and then, there's bad luck in reporting where you do everything right and you do a story on cloned dogs from research in Korea, and then it's all fake. They falsified data. That was in Science magazine. And there's nothing you can do, but you've just told the public about something that turns out to have been falsified. And that happens as well.